you're a Christian watching this video and you've attempted to dialogue with Muslims in the past about whether or not Islam is true, then one of their go-to arguments that you've likely heard is that the reason they believe Islam is true is because Muslims simply worship the same God as Jews and Christians, and therefore they see Islam as this final revelation of this same God to man. It was given once to the Jews, given again to the Christians, and now given then to the Muslims. But does this really hold water? Well, it's no debate that Islam obviously talks about the God of the Bible, but anyone can talk about anything. What ultimately matters is that if this message is truly from this holy and unchanging God, then we should also expect to see this same God represented within Islam as well. And so that's what I want to do today. In part one of this series, I want to go ahead and look at the God of the Bible and really see if he's truly omniscient. And then once we answer that question, we'll be able to compare him to the God of Islam, assuming they're one and the same, and see if we can walk away holding that conclusion still. He counts the number of the stars. He calls them all by name. Great is our Lord and mighty in power. His understanding is infinite. Do you know how the clouds are balanced? Those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? Remember the former things of old. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done. Therefore do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. Now we are sure that you know all things and have no need that anyone should question you. By this we believe that you came forth from God. So from these verses we can see that the Bible clearly teaches God is omniscient. But what about more difficult passages like Genesis 18, where we see how God actually doesn't know if the depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah is as bad as he's heard it's been? Does that mean he's not omniscient? Well, a few things to bear in mind. First, it's important to remember that God often asks questions not for his benefit, but for ours. For example, God asking Adam in Genesis 3 where he is wasn't because he didn't know, but it was to give him a chance to come forward and to come clean about what had happened. Similarly, when he asked the Pharisees about whose inscription was on the coin, it wasn't because he didn't know, but it was to make a point about paying taxes. You could also look at the woman who had the bleeding and touched his garment and was healed. He asked, "Who touched me?" not because he didn't know, but to give the woman a chance to come forward and to showcase her faith. God asking questions is not done for his knowledge, but oftentimes for the benefit of the listener. Second, when looking at the word know in Hebrew, which is yada, it's a word that has many different definitions and uses. For example, Jesus in John 10 said that his sheep hear his voice and he knows them, obviously implying more of a kind of relational definition. In Psalm 1:6, the writer says that God knows the way of the righteous, implying more of a kind of attitude-oriented definition in which God is happy or pleased with the path that a person's taking if it's his will. And so there are multiple definitions, and oftentimes these statements and these questions or what have you are for the benefit of the listener rather than God himself. And so bearing all of these things in mind, let's look at Genesis 18, where God himself takes on human form along with two other angels to go down and to meet with Abraham, as the two angels then go on to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know." This whole chapter details Yahweh taking on human form, language, and limitations in order to come down and personally see the depravity of the city. Why? Because he didn't know? No, but because he was bringing it under his direct observation in order to emphasize how bad the city had gotten and to emphasize his warranted judgment that would soon be coming upon it. Think of a manager who's on vacation but actually catches his employees stealing from the register on camera. Obviously, he knows what's going on, but in order to emphasize his judgment over the situation, he shows up at an unexpected time in person in order to survey the situation himself and to bring that judgment in person. It wasn't for his benefit, but to showcase to the employees that he was serious about the punishment that he was bringing. Now, obviously, he could have just stayed at home and fired them all from home, but the point of him going there physically was to showcase how serious he was about the situation at hand. And this was something, when going back to the Bible, that was also done for Abraham, so that Abraham could see that the Lord just wasn't rashly judging the city, but that he was personally going to go down and see, so that Abraham could know that his judgment was righteous and just from what he had directly seen there with his own eyes that he had taken on form. All right, so we've looked at that, but what about passages like Matthew 24? That's another Muslim favorite in which Jesus himself says that he does not know the day or the hour of his coming. So how could he be God if he doesn't know? But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Well, first of all, it's incredibly ironic how the very passage that Muslims will cite to prove how Jesus was just a man and had no divinity whatsoever is actually the very passage in which Jesus himself exalts himself above all men and angels. Look at the progression within the verse. No man, no angels, not the Son nor the Father. You clearly see this kind of ontological development going on here. Also know how Jesus referring to himself as the Son completely demolishes the Muslim rejection of Jesus' sonship as well as the Father's fatherhood. So we're already 2 for 2 here, and we haven't even actually addressed the argument yet. So in that ontological progression, the reason we can see the Father greater than the Son, even though Trinitarians believe that the Son is equal to the Father, is because, again, the whole express purpose of Jesus' life there on earth was to take on the form of a man, live the sinless life, and be the atoning sacrifice for the sin of the world. And that required a humbling of himself in which he was made lower than the angels. But he's referring to himself, obviously, in the future sense, during the day of the Lord, the second coming. And so we see this delineation here just to emphasize how they're different persons. But the whole express purpose of Jesus' life and ministry was to submit to the will of the Father. This is exactly why Jesus didn't turn the stones to bread when tempted by Satan or jump off the temple, as I talked about in my last video if you want to go ahead and check that out. He was God's servant. He was the Father's servant for his time on earth, again, to be that atoning sacrifice. Now, why is this important? Well, Jesus himself said that a servant does not know what his master is doing. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all the things that I heard from my Father I have made known to you. So in other words, Jesus as God's servant, as the Father's servant, would only do that which was commanded to him directly, which is why he didn't do specific things. It was all pinpointed and predetermined ahead of time. So this is critical because as the Father's servant, Jesus would only do that which the Father had directly revealed and commanded to him, which is exactly what we see throughout the Gospels. Then Jesus said to them, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he and that I do nothing of myself. But as the Father taught me, I speak these things. And he who sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please him. For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me gave me a command, what I should say and what I should speak. And I know that his command is everlasting life. Therefore, whatever I speak, just as the Father has told me, so I speak." He wasn't going to step out of his will and do things that he knew would not be part of his plan, which is why you don't see, him flying through the clouds or just, becoming invisible, walking through walls and doing all this crazy stuff just for the sake of it. It was always for a specific purpose, meant to further the kingdom of God and showcase how he was going to be that Messiah, how he was that Messiah who was dying for the sins of the world. Therefore, as God's servant, as the Father's servant, the Father did not have the will in mind for him to know the day and the hour of his coming. In his waking human consciousness, he didn't know these things because it wasn't the Father's will. The Father had a different purpose in mind because that was for a different time. The purpose now was the first coming. The focus now should have been the first coming, being that atoning sacrifice and living that sinless life and showing others what the Father was like, not getting them focused on the second quite yet. And if that weren't even enough, you can use this very verse as an opportunity to showcase Jesus' deity from the Old Testament. Zechariah offers a very interesting prophecy regarding the second coming of the Lord that directly ties to what we see here. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. So here in Zechariah 14, we can see how it says that Yahweh, upon his second coming, will stand at the Mount of Olives. And yet what do we see in Acts chapter 1? Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey. And so from this, it is clear that the God of the Bible is omniscient. He checks off that box. But what about the God of Islam? If they're one and the same, then we should expect to see that, correct? Well, in part 2 of this, that's exactly what we're going to examine, and I think the answer will shock you. But stay tuned and be on the lookout for more.